Good afternoon. May it please the court, Brianna Arroyo for the state of California. After the defendant, Kevin Jones, was tried and found guilty of first-degree murder by a superior court in Los Angeles, the decision was reversed on his second appeal by the Ninth Circuit of California Appeals. The people of California are here today asking you, Your Honor, to agree with the District Court of California's denial of habeas relief for the two following reasons. First, under Tompkins' decision in 2010, any invocation to remain silent must be made unambiguously. And given the context of Jones' statement, this invocation was not made unambiguously. Secondly, the Ninth Circuit Court relied heavily on the application of the 1984 Smith decision on post-request responses, casting doubt on that initial request to counsel. The application of this is overstretching limitations of this decision. Now we can look at Jones' statement in context because it did not follow any further interrogation by the authorities in the office. Now we look back into the transcript, we can see that after Jones uttered his first statement and supposed invocation, the interrogation was only able to utter a few words before being interrupted by Jones a second time. And now this interruption signifies that those two thoughts were part of the same consciousness.
Well, shouldn't the interrogation arguably just ceased, which is to say that there shouldn't be any transcript after the I don't want to talk no more? Shouldn't the cops just have packed up their bags and stepped out of the room?
Well, in some ways, yes, but I have to say that in the heat of a conversation, such as in an interrogation room, there isn't a lot of space to sort of pause before every statement, so there was a bit of exchange before the interrogation was able to process and then repeatedly ask Jones, I'm sorry, what are you saying? Can you repeat that? So to ask for clarification. And after that clarification was asked, the mention of remaining silent was not mentioned again, which is further to lend to the point that Jones did not, in fact, invoke that invocation of his right. So
shouldn't we though, I mean that sounds to me like you're putting the onus on the suspect to sort of press his right? So it troubles me, and I wonder whether we ought to put the onus on the suspect to reiterate a right versus putting the onus on the police officers to simply respect what would appear to be an otherwise very clear statement from a policy perspective.
that's very true. I would agree in that sense that the onus should not fall on the suspect, but I think it should be a shared onus in the sense that if a suspect is going to invoke that right, then they should remain steadfast in that, and likewise the interrogation should respect that fact. But in the heat of the moment, there was an interruption from the suspect himself that lent more to frustration as opposed to his right to remain silent and his invocation of those clear Miranda rights. So, which is why we can take those two together and learn that it was a sign of frustration as opposed to an invocation. And moving to my second point, the Ninth Circuit's reliance on the Smith decision was overreaching. And this is because that decision said that any individual who requests the right to counsel must do so unambiguously, and it must be respected, and integration must not continue, and the post-request responses may not be used to cast doubt on that initial request. And that is correct. But this did not happen here because this is a case dealing with the right to remain silent. And those two rights are fundamentally different, given that they can be invoked differently. But the right to counsel, you must do so and express it verbally, whereas the right to silence, prior to the Tompkins decision, of course, was able to be invoked verbally, potentially with a gesture to say, I don't want to talk anymore, or the lack of response, which was complete silence. Now, given those multiple ways of invoking the right to silence, context is very important in determining whether it was in fact an invocation of that right. But for argument's sake, even if we were to apply the Smith decision here, which says that interrogation must cease, it still would have no validity in this case because interrogation did cease after this invocation.
But isn't it also the case that under Miranda, or holding in Miranda, that anything a suspect says after telling detectives that he doesn't want to talk anymore is viewed as the product of compulsion and is therefore inadmissible?
Yes, the holding under Miranda does state that any manner that a suspect indicates that right should be honored, and that is correct to an extent, but in this situation, because of the stream of consciousness that Jones continued with both statements, even though there was a few words in between, if it was a pause, they should still be considered under the same stream of consciousness. And in this case, there still should be that continuation of that stream of consciousness and the decision for that. So to wrap up, the right to remain silent must be invoked unambiguously so that any reasonable interrogator may understand it. And it can and should be looked within the context because further interrogation did not happen until after Jones had indicated his willingness to continue speaking with authorities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. May it please the Court, Sara J for Respondent Kevin Jones. I don't want to talk no more, man. I don't want to talk no more, man is a clear statement that invokes the Fifth Amendment and Jones' right to remain silent. In Miranda, when an individual indicates in any manner, in any time, prior to or during a questioning, that he wishes to remain silent, the interrogation must cease. Therefore, the continuation of the interrogation of Johns beyond that point is absolutely illegal under Miranda. The violation of Miranda rights means that the state cannot use any statements that Johns has said beyond his invocation. That also includes using Johns' subsequent statements to doubt the clarity of his initial request to remain silent.
So let me stop you there. It sounds like you're invoking Smith, which is precisely the decision that says that we can't use a post-invocation statement to cast doubt on what is otherwise a clear statement.
Absolutely.
But the petitioner made the argument that Smith is sort of born out of the context of a continuing interrogation, and that's what the language says. You can't use continuing interrogation to cast doubt on an alleged invocation, but that here there was no continuing interrogation, because if we look at the transcript, there actually isn't a question asked before the petitioner, before Jones interrupts and says, you don't want to hear what I'm telling you. So what do you say to the fact that there was no ongoing interrogation in this case so that we actually can look at that post-invocation statement?
There has been continuing questioning. If it was one word, if it was one sentence, if it was one question, it was already one question, one sentence too many. Based on Smith in 1984, and I'm quoting, "It was clearly established that when determining whether the invocation of a constitutional right is ambiguous, that the California court cannot look at post-invocation statements to cast retrospective doubt on the clarity of Jones' request itself. As of the second, Your Honors, we have nothing against Jones other than his statements. We know for a fact that we have no physical evidence that connects Jones to the shooting. No witnesses have said that Jones was the shooter. In fact, witnesses' testimony has said that the car that was used in the shooting is actually different than Jones' car. The California Court of Appeal convicted Jones based on the fact that his statement was ambiguous in the light of the statements that he said beyond that. But his next sentence was, "You don't want to hear what I'm saying," which is simply a pure expression of frustration with the officers, because they simply didn't want to believe him.
Well, so and isn't that precisely though what the trial court found, that there was this expression of frustration happening, not an intent to actually invoke a right, but just a sort of, if you will, a temper tantrum. And so at the very minimum, wouldn't you agree that the statements made by Jones, including that statement that you just said is an evidence of frustration, were arguably ambiguous or equivocal, such that we need to affirm the original trial court's decision?
No. You see, "I don't want to talk no more, man" is not an ambiguous statement. It is very clear-cut. And we can't just assume that this sentence was made out of frustration. Yet it is very clear-cut, and it has one purpose and one purpose only, which is invoking his right to remain silent. Yet, the sentence of "you don't want to listen to me no more" is purely out of frustration. Because if we looked at the case, we see that beyond that point, the police officers were lying to John, saying that we found videotape of you being in the shooting, or you are the shooter. So it was pure frustration of him saying that you are just simply not listening to what I'm trying to say. The police officers clearly understood that Jones was invoking his right to remain silent. And I quote Officer Jolivet after Jones invoked his right to remain silent. He said, "I understand, but the bottom line is." And as I've mentioned before, that one word or that one sentence or that one question, it was already one question too many. And, Your Honors, the Ninth Circuit decision is the most reasonable application of the clearly established Supreme Court law. And that is why I'm asking you today to affirm the decision of the Ninth Circuit. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great work.